After taking the doors off and on about 20 times, I was able to finally get it to fit nice and snug. So what we're going to do next is cut the rabbet on the inside of the doors for the glass panels. And we're going to do that the same way that we cut the rabbet on the back of the case using a rabbeting bit at the router table. So once again, we're going to take the doors off one more time. I've got the router bit set so it's going to make a 7/16 wide by 3/8 of an inch deep rabbet, but I'm going to take this in 2 passes. I got the router bit set up so that it's going to cut a 7/16 and the depth is 3/8, but I got it set to about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to run the doors once and then raise it to its final depth of 3/8. And just like we did with the case, we're going to need to square off these corners since the router bit left them round. So to begin, I'm going to be using a chisel to chop perpendicular to the grain. And once I get close to the scribe line, I'll stick it in the scribe line and chop down. Next, I need to cut some wooden strips to help secure the glass into place. So to do this, I'm going to be using some scrap wood of cherry. This is the same material that I'm using on the cabinet, so I know it's going to look the same. To determine the thickness of the wooden strips, I put the glass panel into the rabbet, and then I use the ruler to determine how thick they need to be. To cut the trim to size, I place it in the rabbet and make a mark where I need to cut. When I'm cutting to the line, I like to leave it a little long so that I can use my low angle jack plane to shoot them to the right size. And I follow this same procedure on the other 3 pieces and the other door. To drill for the shelf pins, I've got a story stick. It's going to make this layout consistent and easy. The length of the story stick is the same distance between the top and the bottom shelf so that it just fits inside of the cabinet. Now my story stick is probably 2 inches wide, and the reason why we want something at least 2 inches wide is because the shelf pin holes are inset 3/4 of an inch from the edge. So I've got it centered about 7/8 of an inch from the edge since we're using a 1/4 inch bit. And the first dimension from the very top to the center of the first hole is 9.5 inches. The center of that hole to the second hole is 7.5, and then again from the second hole to the third hole is 8 1/16. Now the reason there's a third hole is the design or the plans call for just a shelf on the bottom so that your items in the bottom of the cabinet will be elevated and seen through the glass door instead of hidden probably 2 inches or so. So that's the layout of this, and I've also marked the edge of the story stick so that it's always going to be facing out on the front and facing out on the back so that you're positive that the shelf pin holes are inset 3/4 of an inch. So all I'm going to do is clamp it into place and drill the holes. I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch brad point bit because I have 1/4 inch shelf pins themselves. And I've also got a stop collet on my drill bit to make sure that I don't drill in too far. So let's go ahead and drill the shelf pin holes. The cabinet has 2 glass shelves and 1 wooden shelf. We need to determine the width of this wooden shelf. And to do that, I've got the doors clamped into place, and this is the position they're in when they're closed. You just take a measuring tape and measure to the deepest part of where the doors are closed, and it's 5 3/4. But this is the middle of the winter, and I know this panel is going to expand come June and July, so I'm going to subtract about 1/8 of an inch from that measurement. The length of the shelf is going to be the same as the glass shelf, so whatever measurement you come up with will be the same for the glass shelf, or the wooden shelf rather. Now this is also going to have a taper on it, just like the glass shelf. So to figure out how narrow that needs to be, we can measure from where the door closes on the inside of the side panel all the way back to where the shelf or where the back panel starts. And that for me is 4 7/8, but again I'm going to subtract 1/8 of an inch. So it's going to be 5 3/4 here in the middle to 4 7/8 on the ends. And I'm just going to taper that again the same way we did the top and the bottom panel. Now that we know what the dimensions are of the bottom shelf, I can cut it to width and length at the table saw. To begin the taper, I mark a center line on the board, and then I mark up 4 7/8 from one end and 4 7/8 from the other, and then I use a straight edge to connect those two lines on both sides. Next we move over to the bandsaw and remove the waste, staying about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from the line. To clean up the bandsaw marks, I'm going to be using my low angle jack plane to slowly work my way down to my line. With the doors and the cabinet done, we can go ahead and switch gears and talk about the veneered back panel. When veneering a panel, it's best to put veneer on both sides to just help equalize the panel to prevent any cupping and warping. On the front, I'm using some really beautiful curly English sycamore, and so on the back, since you're never going to see it, I'm just going to use some cheaper veneer. I got this veneer for free, and it's not bad looking either. It's nice curly cherry veneer, so I'm going to put that on the back. This curly cherry veneer is not wide enough, so I'm going to have to use 2 pieces. So what I'm doing first is putting some blue tape on the back side of the veneer to hold these together so that I can then flip it over and use some veneer tape to hold it together. Next I'm going to put about 10 to 12 little pieces of the veneer tape on the seam on the other side. So I run the shiny side of the tape over some water and then place it over the seam. The good thing about this veneer tape is as it dries it shrinks, so it helps to pull everything together. And finally I'm going to lay a piece of veneer tape across the full length of the joint. So this is the curly sycamore, and as you can see, it's some really beautiful veneer. And luckily, it's actually 18 inches wide, which is wider than I need. I almost hate to cut into this, but it's too wide for what I need. And as you can see, look at both sides. If you see any flaws, make sure you put that on the inside. That's going to get the glue so that you won't see it. Next, I lay the 1/4 inch MDF panel over the veneer, and then I cut it to size. To do the cutting, I'm using a veneer saw. Now that the veneer tape has dried on the back panel, I can remove the painter's tape. To prep the surface for the veneer, I like to use 80 grit sandpaper to scuff both sides of the panel. And then I use a brush to remove the dust from the panel. I'm using a light colored cold pressed veneer glue for this process. The veneer glue is a little bit thicker than your standard glue, so it helps to minimize squeeze out. And to spread the glue, I'm using an ink roller. I'm going to use the ink roller on both sides, and then I'll place it in a bucket of water so that I can then clean it off later and use it multiple times. Next, I place the back veneer on first, making sure that the veneer tape is facing up because that's the outside of the veneer that I want showing. Now I'm going to flip the veneered panel over and place it on top of a waxed piece of MDF that's going to act as a platen. Now I can put glue on the other side and then place the sycamore veneer on top. With both pieces of the veneer on, I go ahead and use some blue tape to hold them into place just to make sure they don't shift when I place them in the bag. And I complete the sandwich with using a top platen. And again, these are waxed MDF. That's really important to make sure that they don't stick. Next, I place the bottom platen into the bag, and then I place the sandwich on top of the platen. And on top of that, I have a plastic breather mesh that allows air to flow away from the panel and towards the vacuum port. And now I can close up the bag and let the vacuum pump run for about an hour until the glue sets up. I've got the panels out of the bag and we can go ahead and remove the veneer tape from the back. It's really simple to do, just take a wet cloth and get the veneer tape wet and it should come right off. Since the panels were just a little oversized, all it took was a few swipes of the block plane to make it nice and flush. To trim the overhang on the top and the bottom of the panel, since it's end grain, I'm going to be using my table saw. To help prevent tear out on the top and the bottom of both sides of the panel, I put blue painter's tape on before making the pass. And as you can see, it came out just perfect. When it comes to hardware on any cabinet or any project, it's a pretty personal thing, and not everybody will like the same kind of style. Now, the PDF file didn't have any sort of template to make the door pulls that they used. So what I've done is come up with something that I like that's a pretty minimal approach, and I've included a PDF file on the Guild over at SimpleCoveGuild.com that you can download, scale, make it larger, make it smaller, but it'll give you the same thing that I've got. Now, as far as the location of the door pulls, I've reassembled and put the doors back on. And I'm going to put the very tip of the door pull right at 8 inches on this inset stile. Now, I'm also going to center it on this stile just to give my fingers enough room to reach in there and open both doors at the same time. So again, that's just a personal preference. If you guys want to center it, that's cool, but that's how I'm going to do this. So let me go ahead and show you how I made these door pulls. To begin, I got a piece of walnut that I'm going to be making the door handles out of. That is 3/8 of an inch thick, and I'm going to be cutting it to 7/8 of an inch in width. Next, out of the scrap, I cut 2 pieces to 2 inches long. Next, I place the template over the walnut and then trace it. One way to ensure that the pulls are identical is to tape one to the other before making the cuts. That way when you shape it, cut it, and then make all your final changes to it, they're going to be identical. And to begin the cutting, I head over to the bandsaw to remove the majority of the waste. To do the shaping of the pulls, I'm using the spindle sander with the smallest spindle that I had. After a few minutes of shaping, this is the design that I went with. Before gluing on the door pulls, I'm going to go ahead and sand both sides of the doors. That way it's not in the way when it's laying on its face and I'm sanding the back. And I'm also going to go ahead and sand the veneered panel with 220 grit sandpaper to get it finish ready. And then after that, we're going to glue on the door pulls and then it's time for finish. I'm sure you can guess by now, but it's 80, 120, 180, and then 220 grit. And on the veneer panel, it's only 220 grit because it's thin and you don't want to take a chance and burn through the veneer. And I almost forgot, don't forget to sand the bottom shelf. This is the perfect time to do that as well. The doors are sanded, so now we can go ahead and glue on the door pulls. Like I did over here, I'm going to put blue painter's tape on 3 sides because I still need one side that I can use to reference just to make sure that it's in the correct location as far as it being centered across the width. And I'll have a real faint line that I drew on the doors that I left when the doors were hanging. You'll never see it because I put it right up against that line, and with finish it'll disappear. But now I know for sure that it's going to be in the right location. And this also gives it a little ledge to put it up against, so when I put the door pull right back down, it'll butt up against that blue painter's tape. And again, double check. I got my combination square set to 7/16. Now we can put glue on the bottom side. We are going to get squeeze out, but we'll do the best that we can. I just got a wet paper towel to wipe up any of the glue and make sure that they're in the right orientation, and then just stick it back down. Again, using the combination square to confirm that it's centered. And I'm going to let this set for probably 20 minutes or so just to tack up before I put a clamp on it, because I'm afraid it's going to move. I'm going to put pressure on it and do a rub joint to get all the air out. And it shouldn't need much, as long as it's nice and flat. We're good to go.